Okay, I thank you for this chance to talk with you today. And my life story is so jumbled, it's hard to know what to tell and what not to tell, you know? But in the 1980s, I went to Scotland to a little intentional community called Findhorn, and I spent several weeks there. And while there, I visited a weaver studio. In that studio, I saw a whole wall, an array of colors, of threads, textures, and colors. It was gorgeous and so unusual. And I'd never seen such an array of color. And I was kind of stunned. And I watched the weaver, and all of a sudden, the image came of my life as a tapestry of threads. So I'd like to tell you some of the main threads of my life. And if I go on too long, I hope that Libby will stop me. It's hard to keep track of time. One strong thread. I was born a motherless child, but it only lasted for about 10 hours. That's when my adoptive parents found me and took me home. They had gotten a sudden call, went to a private nursing home in Macon, Georgia, met my birth mother, chatted with her a few minutes, promised her they would take care of this baby, and left with the 10-hour-old infant. They went to Woolworth's department store and bought diapers and blankets and bottles because they'd had no warning this was happening on this day. Then they wrapped me up and we got into a Model A Ford, and they drove to my father's home, my mother and father's home. He was a Southern Baptist minister in a little church in rural Georgia. He'd been run out of the last church he was in because they said he was a nigger lover. This was the 1930s. And I think both my parents were a little different in their attitude toward African Americans. We were a very segregated community in Georgia in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. But my parents gifted me in the thread of my life with their attitude about other people. And I think that attitude came from the Christian roots and their commitment to them. There was something about respecting other people that they gave me, and I am so grateful for that. Another thread, I have to look at my notes a little bit or I'll ramble too much. Another thread was my being a minister's kid, a preacher's kid. I was supposed to be an example all the time. I was supposed to be good. I was supposed to be exceptional. I memorized Bible verses. I memorized songs. I memorized poems. I quoted and I performed, and I did pretty well at that until I turned about 11 or 12 and I quit because I did not want to perform at other people's behest anymore. That not wanting to have people tell me what to do is another thread that has really run all through my life, even up until now. But I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and all the time music was a very important thread in my life. My parents had sung to me as an infant. I sang as soon as I learned to talk, I began to sing. I took piano lessons when I was 6, but I had a teacher who introduced each piece to me by playing it. So I didn't learn to read music. I just played by ear for the first 2 years I was taking piano. Then my teacher discovered that And he didn't introduce them by playing them anymore. I had to just learn to read music. At about 9, I joined an adult choir because they were very short of altos, and I had an alto voice even then. And music has just always been a very, very important part of my life. Another thread, college. I left Savannah at 17 and went to Mars Hill College in Western North Carolina near Asheville. I'd spent my whole life in Savannah and around there, spending all the summers at Savannah Beach, Tybee Island. But when I moved to Western North Carolina, I fell in love with the mountains. I just love that part of the country. And it was a good place for me because I was introduced to a lot of exploration and learning. I really kind of became emotionally alive at that time in ways, in terms of pursuing an intellectual ability that I'd never had. I hadn't done that well in high school. But when I got to college, I really loved learning, and that was a new experience for me. I studied psychology, of course, the basic science courses, but I also had a study group there, and we were reading philosophy and psychology and batting ideas around. And that kind of thread has been with me all of my life. I've always found friends I could do that with. I finished my college at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and I met my husband there, Dick Flowers. But, I forgot something. When I was a sophomore in college, another important thread came into my life. I found out that I had a birth brother, a biological brother. I came home from college one time and my parents handed me an envelope and said, "We want to talk to you about something." And I figured, what have I done wrong now? And they gave me the envelope, and I read a letter from a man who said he had been in his grandmother's home, had been looking through some papers, found my adoption papers, stuffed them in his pocket without saying anything. And now he was writing to the attorney on that to try to get in touch with me. The letter had been forwarded to my parents with the assurance that they had no legal obligation to respond to it. But my parents gave it to me, and I read it. And I decided I really did want to meet this brother, but I did not want to meet anybody else in this biological family. I already had a family. So my father drove 140 miles down to check him out and be sure it was okay for me to meet him. And then they drove me down to Brunswick, Georgia, where he lived, dropped me at his house. They went on to have dinner with friends, and my brother Gene and I went out for dinner. And I looked across that table at him, and for the first time, I saw reflections of my own face, my jawline, my eyes. And it was uncanny how many things we had in common, considering he'd grown up in a very different background than mine. We became lifelong friends, and he and his family became an important part of my life until he died a few years ago. And even now, that family is a part of my life. I did meet my birth mother when I was 40. I met him when I was about 20. I met my birth brother when I was about 40, but I did not have the close tie with her that I did with my brother. To go back to my college years, I met my husband at Furman. We were married in a big wedding in Savannah, Georgia. And I went with him to Louisville, Kentucky, because he was studying at the Southern Baptist Seminary there. So I was a minister's daughter, and I married a minister. Imagine that. I learned a lot there because it was the most liberal of the Southern Baptist seminaries, and current theologians were being introduced to him. And so I learned a lot about them too. I was teaching And I also worked on weekends as a scribe for the director of a psychiatric unit in the hospital. And it was there that I honed some of my understandings about psychology and about how the processes work and about psychiatry and about mental illness. It was a very important experience for me. After leaving Louisville, Kentucky, Dick and I and my daughter, Lisa, who had been born in Kentucky, moved to Houston, Texas, where he was an intern at the Texas Medical Center in clinical pastoral education. That was his major interest and field. After he finished that, we moved to Fort Worth, Texas, where he pursued a degree. But I really wasn't a Texan. And fortunately, he got a job near Philadelphia at Seminary, teaching clinical pastoral education. During the time that we were married, I did a lot of typing of verbatim interviews for him. And that again gave me a lot of experience and understanding about how people told their own life stories and how things had influenced their lives. So I'm very grateful for those experiences. At Crozer, wow, it was an amazing place. It was a very liberal seminary at that time. And I was introduced to ideas far beyond any I'd had before. At Crozer, there was an important wing of the seminary there called the Martin Luther King School for Social Change. Basically, it was a part of the seminary that taught grassroots organizing. And Dick and I were active in that community. And really, it was within that group that I had the first tiny glimpse of what it was like to be a minority. I went with a group of friends to a rally for Malcolm X. At that rally, it was jam-packed, and it was in Philadelphia. And I went in and I sat down just in the aisle because it was so crowded. And there I was with my long blonde hair and white skin in a sea of Black people. And there were bodyguards around the widow of Malcolm X. And I felt those bodyguards watching me. And I had just a tiny glimpse of what it was like to have everybody a little bit suspicious of me and what I was doing and what business I had there. It was a tiny glimpse, but it was a very important one for me. And that thread has stayed with me until now. But during those years at Crozer, my personal life had not gone so well. Dick and I were different in so many ways, and we grew apart, and both of us recognized we could not live together. So we divorced. He moved to California. Lisa and I moved to Swarthmore. And Crozer merged with Colgate Rochester Seminary here. After a while in Swarthmore, I thought, why am I here? No family here. All of my friends had moved away. I thought about moving to Atlanta, where I had a lot of relatives and friends. I thought about moving to Savannah, but neither felt right for me. So I decided I'd move to Rochester, where I had this support community of close friends I'd had for 5 or 6 years. I packed up U-Haul, drove it up to Rochester, and began to look for a job here. Fortunately, I had the support of many friends from Crozer who had moved just the previous year to Rochester. I found a job. I wanted one with the city school district because I'd been teaching in suburban schools and I was kind of tired of those challenges and wanted a different kind. And I found them here. My first job here was down in an area of Rochester. It was with a follow-through program, which followed kids after they finished the Head Start program. And I worked in a setting in North Joseph Avenue and North Clinton, St. Paul, Bittner Street, a very rough area of Rochester at that time. And I learned a lot there. Subsequently, oh, I forgot to tell you, I'd gotten a library degree at Drexel University while I was living in Swarthmore. So I founded a job here in Rochester as a library media specialist in the city school district. And I worked there for many, many years in many different schools, ending my professional career at School of the Arts, and I had loved all of those years of teaching. I loved helping people find out things, helping kids learn what they wanted to learn. It was just a challenge for me, and I loved it all. And I retired before I got burned out. That was a blessing. Oh, I hear my beeper going off. That means I've got to quit here.
Grace, don't rush. You've got, you know,
a few minutes.
According to my clock, if you went another 10 minutes before we started questions, we're fine.
Okay, give me a warning. Here in Rochester, a few months after I moved here, I began dating a divorced man in the Crozer community. I mean, I was the daughter of a minister. I'd been married and divorced from a minister. And now I was dating a minister. Clearly, I was a slow learner. But Jesse Brown and I were married. I had one child. He had 3. We were definitely planning to live together happily ever after with this wonderful blended family, which would be such an easy thing. But of course, it was not. The kids had a hard time being together in the family. It was very different for all of them, especially for Lisa. Colgate Rochester was losing students at the time, and Jesse lost his position as Old Testament professor. He retooled and went to Nazareth as a chaplain, and there he fell in love with one of his students. I'd had a 10-year marriage with Dick. I'd had a 10-year marriage with Jesse. And I fought for about a year trying to rescue that marriage. But it was one-sided. And with a lot of conflict and anguish, we divorced. I moved to Penfield. Lisa was in high school. But I was devastated. I started over, but I had such good friends here. And I had professional help to try to get me through that time that was so hard. I still had a wonderful job, and I still had a wonderful daughter, and life went on. My daughter finished high school. She finished college at Denison University. She moved back to Rochester and worked briefly for a small educational software firm called Logical Operations. She moved to Buffalo and was director of a branch unit there for a time. Then she worked for Citibank and moved to Baltimore. She met her husband, had a good 10-year marriage, and then another huge thrill of my life happened. She began to exhibit very bizarre behavior. Her husband and I saw that. Eventually, he left. I went down to try to see what I could do. I knew immediately that she needed psychiatric help, but getting her into a psychiatric hospital, getting her into an emergency room was a real challenge. But eventually we got there. She was admitted into a unit and she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. For the next 8 or 10 years, she was in and out of hospitals, most of the time with mania. She would be admitted, discharged after a few weeks. We would start her life all over again. She would get manic, be admitted again, be discharged. That lasted a long time, and my own mental stability became threatened. So with a lot of support from friends and with really good professional help, I survived. And Lisa survived. She eventually decided to move to Atlanta. She lives there, had become much more stable, and she and I are in a very close relationship. She's been an important part of my life. In these last decades of my life, I'm going to throw my notes aside. In the last decades of my life, I have been pursuing the last decade or two bird watching, my volunteer work with hospice patients for about 20 years. I became a master gardener and I love to garden. Of course, I'm a reader. Librarians are always readers. And my spiritual quest. When I moved to Rochester, I joined First Baptist Church, but soon we became members of the House Church, which was a small group of people who formed a church that met in homes. There were several of the professors from Colgate Rochester in the group. We were a group of about 10 or 12 when it started, and that house church went on for about 12 years. It was an important group. It became an extended family for all of us. We had no paid ministers. We met in each other's homes. We planned intergenerational services. Our money went to 3 denominational associations, American Baptist, Episcopal, and United Church of Christ. But other than nominal fees to those organizations, all of our money went to social projects here in Rochester. That was important to me, and it gave me a lifelong desire to be a part of a different kind of community than the churches that I had grown up in. After about 12 years, and I was a very active member of that church, I began to really burn out. So I left and didn't go to church for a few months. I was bird watching avidly. I was gardening. I was traveling. But eventually I needed a faith community. And I visited First Unitarian Church with the clear desire not to get involved. I was only going to go in, attend a service, and get out. So I would go in at the beginning of a service, slip in, sit at the back, listen to the sermon, listen to the service, and slip out before I could talk to anybody, lest anybody drag me in there or lest I choose to get involved. But the music was wonderful, and I couldn't resist it. I joined the choir after about a year. Ed Shell was the director of the choir, and I loved it, and I met so many wonderful friends there. I was in the church for many years, have been in the church for many years. I joined in the 80s, I think it was. During the time I was a member of this church, I helped with Dean Brown, and I helped to start participation in the RAIN program for homeless families. I participated in the whole church undertaking, building a playground in a public school here in Rochester. It was a great experience. And I served in many committees and boards, and it has been a wonderful experience for me. During all of my life, I have always felt I had a calling, sometimes to first one thing and then another. But I found words that sort of put that calling into words that I could not really say. So I'd like to read a poem to you that I feel expresses what I feel my life calling is. It's by D.H. Lawrence. As we live, we are transmitters of life. And when we fail to transmit life, life fails to flow through us. But giving is not so easy. It doesn't mean handing life out to some mean fool or letting the living dead eat you up. It means kindling the life quality where it was not. And that's what I felt my calling has been, with the people I know, with strangers I meet, with the groups I'm in, to try to kindle and in myself, to try to kindle the life quality. So that's the story of all the threads of my life pulled together in a few minutes, with a lot of raveling and still some loose ends. Thank you.